Good evening. I'm George Davis, Marketing and Special Events Coordinator with WGVU Public Media. Thank you so much for logging on for this virtual event this evening entitled The Black Honest Truth, presented by WGVU Shaping Narratives Project, supported and in partnership with the WK Kellogg Foundation. And tonight's dialogue will be led by Christine Mwangi. Christine is a friend of the station and a partner with us in the Shaping Narratives Project. Christine is a native of Kenya whose family migrated to the United States in 1997. And at the age of 11, she was introduced to Black as a racial identity in her community in Baltimore, Maryland. Mwangi continued to have varying racial experiences as her studies took her to Manchester, England, and back to the United States. Then in 2018, Christine worked as program director at the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance, or LEDA, a role that gave her the agency and a voice to address social justice matters from the lived experience and lens of a Black African immigrant. Today, Christine envisions a community and a world where the social dynamics within the Black community are more collaborative, and the civic duty to dismantle racism is equally shared within the Black community despite ethnic origin or background. Ladies and gentlemen, Christine Mwangi. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much to WGVU, NPR, PBS, and everybody watching. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am honored to be here to share my vision and ideas surrounding what I see to be a community of united Black people. As George so described, I have lived in spaces where my identity of Blackness has been redefined constantly, and the expectations of how I am to be, how I am to react, how I'm to be received were constantly changing as well. And so in the present times and in light of everything that we are going through as in fact, a globe, not just a nation, I found it really important to start having these dialogues where we look at how different Black people are experiencing the world around them, and specifically here in the United States in the wake of everything that is going on that deals with and highlights the racism that is around us. And so I am so honored today to delve into this important topic by Commissioner Joe Jones. He is a person and a man who I admire greatly in the work that he does in our community through the Urban League of Grand Rapids. And he also, on top of serving as the president and CEO of Urban League of West Michigan Grand Rapids, he is representing the second ward as city commissioner and assistant pastor of Brown Hutcherson Ministries. He serves in a myriad of boards, does so much for our community, and our most recent gubernatorial appointment to the Board of Trustees at Oakland University, his alma mater. So Joe and his wife, Jessie, have 4 children, 5 grandchildren, and he loves reading, jazz, and golf. So before we delve into our program this evening, you will hear 2 sound clips played back to back, one of a descriptive nature of my experiences since migrating to the United States, and one of Joe's experiences as he hails from Detroit and his journey to Grand Rapids. So those will come on right now, and then we will have a discussion following. 1997 was the year of my family's great migration. We moved to Baltimore, Maryland from Nairobi, Kenya, and we're blessed to have both family and friends to welcome us to this new country and to a new way of life. The first thing I noticed, there were so many white people everywhere. And this was just at the airport. Our apartment was just shy of a mile from school, which meant we couldn't take the bus. And we had to walk. It was a perfect time for reflection, and I also walked to school in Nairobi. But there were sharp differences.
Back home, people had beautiful gardens and lawns, but they were behind high walls. Here, they didn't even have fences. So the sight of America's exposed lawns was both strange and also oddly intimate. See, on my walk to school in Nairobi, I would knock on my neighbors' gates and see if they'd join me on the walk to school together. In Baltimore, if you knocked, doors opened into folks' living room. People here didn't even have curtains on their windows sometimes. What was that about? I mean, really, I get being yourself inside your home, but maybe I don't want to see it. You know what I mean? It's a bit much for 8 a.m. Back home, we had bars on our windows and curtains. My sister Hilda and I, we also joked about Americans walking their canine friends and picking up their warm poop with their bare hands, putting it inside a bag, and then carrying the stinky package until they got home. Kenyan dogs were trained guard dogs. Ain't nobody picking up their poop with bare hands. I'm just saying, we didn't come to America for this. As we got closer to school, we saw more kids walking too. Hilda and I got quiet. We intently studied the other kids and realized they were also studying us. But let me paint a picture for you. In Nairobi, we wore formal uniforms. A royal blue sweater sitting on a light blue button-up shirt decorated by striped orange and a navy tie. We wore pleated navy blue skirts, white knee-high tube socks, and black patent leather shoes. In Baltimore, circa 1997, my mom thought light stonewashed jeans, a bright colored t-shirt, and whatever discount sneakers she found at Payless made a good enough first impression, which would have been accurate had we been auditioning for a Vanilla Ice video a decade earlier. All we were missing were some fanny packs. Kids in those days were sporting Timberland boots, apple bottom jeans, and baby fat t-shirts. We did not fit in. My classes in Baltimore were smaller than in Nairobi. That was a plus academically, but it made it harder to fly under the radar with my classmates or avoid idiotic questions like, did we have elephants roaming in our yard? Remember the walls? Or did we have cars? Except for the 1.1 million automobiles in Nairobi and the brand new Mercedes that my father had shipped from Germany. Nah, not really. The academic testing we had to do coming in placed me 2 years ahead, from 6th to 8th grade. But they couldn't advance me that far ahead in Baltimore, so I landed in the 7th grade. See, in Nairobi, I had a class called GHC, which stood for Geography, History, and Civics. I didn't hear the word civics in the US until high school. They were not optional in Kenya. I learned English, Swahili, and I spoke my native tribal language of Kikuyu. We had 13 subjects in school back home. Here, it was 5 or 6. The Baltimore County Public School also put me in all honors classes, where I noticed something peculiar. Most of my classmates were white. And by most, I mean all.
Let me tell you a little something about growing up on the east side of the D. What? That's right, the D, the 313, Motor City, Motown, or how I've described it in the past, God's country. Youngest of 9 with 4 brothers and 4 sisters, I was blessed to be the recipient of unconditional love from Arthur and Lynette Jones. They epitomized Black love. My pops worked his whole life for the U.S. Post Office after returning home from World War II. My mom's was a homemaker. Wasn't much of a choice, you know. I mean, can you imagine what the daycare bill would have been with all those children? Not. I consider myself fortunate that I was reading Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Jet Magazine, Ebony, and even National Geographic when I was in grade school. So guess what that did for me? It allowed me to determine early on that I could be anything I wanted to be, because not only was I reading about Black pride and success, I was seeing it every day of my life. You know how hard it is to be something or someone that you can't see? Reading took me into a whole different stratosphere. It took me beyond Van Dyke and taught me the power of words and language. As I grew up, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, a lawyer, or even a teacher. However, that all changed once I was old enough to understand politics. When I saw a Black man become mayor of Detroit, Mayor Coleman Young, man, that dude could hold his own at Atlantic Barbershop, Red Jazz Shoe Shine, and then turn around and head to City Hall for a meeting with the presidents of GM, Ford, and Chrysler. I mean, you got to know that the barber and shoe shine shop are considered holy ground in the Black community. It's where you listen, watch, and learn who's who in the neighborhood. It's equivalent to undergrad courses in communications and sociology. And speaking of communications, I learned how to communicate effectively with various cultures while growing up in the D. But my intro to communications in the dominant culture came by way of college. Growing up in the D meant not having regular interaction with white folks. So it's fair to say that it was a shock to my system when I graduated from Martin Luther King Jr. Senior High School and ventured 31 miles north to the suburb of Rochester to attend Oakland University. Look, I went from being part of the majority to part of the minority in like 30 minutes flat. What the heck? But growing up in the D and moving to the burbs for school also meant new experiences, new norms. Like going to 7-Eleven for the first time in my life at like 3 o'clock in the morning for a study break. Why is that such a big deal, you ask? Because there is no 7-Eleven open 24 hours in the D. Man, as funny as this may sound, going someplace at 3 o'clock in the morning felt like freedom to me. I lived with my nephew in a dorm room, but our suite mates were these two white cats from Bay City. It was clear from the beginning that they hadn't had too much interaction with Black folk previous to college. They made a whole lot of assumptions about what it meant to grow up in the D. They would brazenly ask questions about drug dealing, drug usage, and gang violence, as if my nephew and I were frickin' Avon Barksdale and Nino Brown. Like, WTH. That pissed me off on the regular, as I had to remind them that Detroit was not French for ghetto. Although I experienced what I did at OU, I don't know if anything could have prepared me for the 616, AKA Grand Rapids, Michigan. About 160 miles from my homestead in the 313. It's where my political career really took off. I can remember like it was yesterday, 24 years worth of yesterdays. I had never been to GR prior to visiting my beloved and her family. Heck, I'd never been past Lansing. This was new territory for me. I felt like Black pioneer William J. Hardy when he made his way to Kent County. I assumed that the 616 meant farms and slow living. I didn't know Brother Calvin from Sister Hope, CRC from RCA. But once again, my saving grace was a commitment to read everything I could get my hands on, from the GR Times to the GR Press, from Equality Magazine to Unity Magazine to Grand Rapids Magazine to the Grand Rapids Business Journal. I committed myself to learning what Blackness meant in GR, because Blackness means something different depending on proximity. Let me tell you something. I've learned a heck of a lot about myself, like patience is a virtue. My city, GRAP, is resource rich. My community, the Black community of Grand Rapids, is rich in legacy and resilience. And my culture here in the 616 is significant. I find myself leaning more into the words of our ancestors, our forefathers and foremothers, who pioneered their way north and west during the Great Migration. Even those who decided to stay put in the South. Their stories are still relevant because they speak to the power of resilience, struggle, perseverance, overcoming incredible odds, and aspiring to live a life of dignity and respect. Their stories are full of aspiration and the power of possibility. Their stories are now our stories. Their Blackness, their sense of self-worth had value. Now it's about reminding Black Grand Rapids that we have value too. And not only that, we have a story to tell. So we need to run and tell it. We need to model what the next generation wants and needs to see.
All right. That was amazing. That was amazing, Joe. Thank you for recording that piece for us. And so I think what really stood out to me were three things. I heard value, I heard migration, and I heard stories. So in thinking about the makeup of the Black community in Grand Rapids, to be specific, I wrote down Black American, I wrote down African, I wrote down even refugee, I wrote down Caribbean. Um, what's how do you feel that our stories of migration from our respective native spaces became so separate that once here we rarely find commonality? How do you think, starting, it's always nice to start with history, how did we get here, with our stories of migration perhaps even getting lost along the way? Because some of the things you were talking about, I didn't know. I still don't claim to know the full extent of stories of migration of Southern Blacks to the Northern states. Again, not a lot of this is not covered in school curriculums, despite being in the US education system since age 11. So where do you think our stories get lost, and why aren't we telling them to one another if the education system is not providing us with those blueprints?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, Christine. It is an absolute pleasure to hang with you, sis.
Yeah.
Um, I'm often, I think the word is perplexed in that we, I think as a community, don't take the opportunity to recognize the similarities. I think it's part of the very culture that we're a part of, and that is to quite often recognize differences. But I think in particular, when it comes to our people, those who are rich in melanin, it's the understanding that, we come from, one place, and we got here, we took different paths to get here. Some of us were very much forced to be here, goes without saying, based on the historical understanding of chattel slavery. And yet, there is so much richness in the stories of our African brothers and sisters, our Caribbean brothers and sisters. Those who, again, their journey here speaks of travailing. It speaks of the ability to overcome. And it really, I think, further defines and almost solidifies the fact that, folks of African descent have just, I don't want to say cornered the market in overcoming, but, we have just continued to kind of defy the odds. And I think the more that we know that about one another, regardless of where we originated from in terms of, our whether it was the Caribbean or whether it was back home in Africa, we need to find and really be intentional about not just supporting, but lifting up the similarities. And
Absolutely.
I think it speaks to the importance of what we're talking about here today, which is narrative. It's like, who is controlling the narrative? And I'm a communications guy, and to me, words matter. Words matter a lot, right? And so, what words are we using to describe who we are, to describe how we got here? Are we operating from an asset based approach, or is it a deficit model? I want to suggest that you know, from here on in, we really need to commit or recommit to really talking about things from an asset based, because that's, again, when I look at the columns, you know, you're an asset, I'm an asset. I'm
Yes.
no freaking liability. You hear me? And
Mm,
I think it's part of what has been cast on Black folks historically is this idea that we are a liability,
wow.
and that's just there's nothing farther from the truth.
Right, right. And I really like what you said about narrative and the fact that to understand and to pick out the similarities you have with somebody, there has to be a level of proximity to that person. There has to be relationship. And I'll be honest, one of the times in my life where I got up close and personal to a group of Black people different from me and truly developed some empathy for them was when I was working as an interpreter for the Congolese refugees here in Grand Rapids. And I speak Swahili, which most of them do. And in before I started interpreting for them, if you would have asked me to define what a refugee is, I would have probably said somebody without a home, somebody without a family, somebody running away from their home. But I wouldn't have told you about things that I found I had in common with them. These were people with families like mine who had daughters like I was to my parents, who had the desire to give their family a good life. Depending on the country they were fleeing, life dealt them a very bad hand. And despite they survived, they prevailed. I also did not have any idea how long people spend in refugee camps, and that my native country of Kenya is the host of one of the largest refugee camps, Kakuma, in East Africa. When we lived in Kenya, my parents had never talked about a refugee camp. We had never seen one, and people were born there, lived there for years before being resettled to different Western countries. So I just grew such great empathy during those months that I worked as an interpreter. And I wondered how many other stories are getting lost and being translated in different ways by the media that do not really represent the essence of their communities, nor do they sow hope to their communities or get them the help they need, because people on the outside are getting false or many variations of the true narrative. But by listening to those people talk about their experiences with different community organizations, and I was there simply to be a conduit of information, I would go home with such a heavy heart of, you know, what if I wasn't there? What if they weren't able to get their message across, to ask for help the way they need it? And I often wonder how many missed opportunities we have here locally among different Black communities because we don't get to hear each other's narratives firsthand. We hear them with the biased lens of the media and different other outlets we have for information. Could you share with us an experience you've had where you developed a relationship or were in close proximity with a narrative that you hadn't heard before of someone in the Black community and how that affected or impacted you?
Sure. I had the again, as was mentioned in the clip, I had the experience of growing up in a city that it was predominantly Black, and
Mm-hmm.
I always tell the story of it was actually at an event here. It was one of the larger foundations in the country, and there was a gathering that was here in Grand Rapids, and there was a brother there from Detroit, and he said something that both shook and shocked a lot of people who were there.
Mm.
He too was born and raised in Detroit, had never moved outside of Detroit. And he made a statement and people they were so taken aback. He said that he had never experienced racism.
Wow.
And so that was the response from many of folks who were there. And I think what he was trying to say, and I could be wrong, but I think what he was trying to say is that he had never really experienced it, from the perspective of in terms of I would suggest that he had experienced systemic racism, but perhaps not that in the form of flat out discrimination. Why? Because he grew up in a city that it was all Black. So that guess what? His teachers were like mine, were primarily all Black. Let's see, I'm sure his neighbors were predominantly all Black. The guy who cut his hair was all Black. The grocery store he went to probably had folks who worked there who were all Black. His doctor was everybody. And so
Right.
that was, if you would have seen and there were those who were there who wanted to give him a piece of their mind, as if to say,
Mm,
you sound like a fool. But I knew, I mean, it's like I had to catch myself because I was pretty quick to understand, okay, I see what he's saying.
right.
Because again, I want to suggest that although I did not perhaps face discrimination while growing up in Detroit a whole lot, I experienced racism because of the
Mm,
systemic type of racism. When you look at when you look at Detroit or other major urban cores and the inequities that are in play, that's systemic. That's an example of systemic racism. So,
correct.
but that there, I think, again, it shook folks, but it also shocked folks. Right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. That is amazing. I mean, I had that reaction just
Right.
now. Wow. And what I find interesting when you talk about the different variations of racism and how we experience it, whether it be systemic, institutionalized in the places of work that we occupy, individual, etc., is I know growing up, it's not that I didn't experience racism and at a certain age began talking to my parents about it. In fact, my father experienced a very overt type of racism at a dealership he was working in where the N-word was spray painted or written somehow on his workplace locker room and a locker. And so I do remember the consolation conversation in our household being, this is not our fight. Like, keep your eye on the prize. You came here for a reason. We are here so you and your sister can have an education. This is a small thing compared to the things we've been through. Those kind of, ways to rationalize that immediate hurt and pain. And as you can imagine, where we came from, we came from a place where, like I mentioned, I had to learn to be Black when I got here. Like the color of our skin and the way we are born and God created us had never been weaponized against us. And so, and like I tell people all the time, when you migrate to the United States, you don't get a little handbook at customs when you clear to come on this side that says, here is what to expect in America. If you are Black, you will experience racism. There will be discrimination. You might be called the N-word. Your children might be outcasted at school. Watch out for your accent. Your clothes may not be helping you fit in, this and the other. Like, nobody tells you that. So it's up to you to learn it as you go based on the interactions that you have. And so I just grew up not having an outlet, a place to process what was happening. And I guess the defense mechanism of my parents and those of their generation was keep your eye on the prize. We see it, we feel it, but they didn't have the talking points even to tell us what was happening, or they didn't want to engage. I still don't know the answer to that because it got to a point for me, I couldn't disengage any longer. I was constantly thrusted in these spaces that I had to defend my Blackness. And my father, being an entrepreneur, he stopped working for various institutions and became a business owner. That was his insulation, being the boss in a space, and he dealt with it with humor. And so I remember, I'll tell you this because it'll make you laugh. My father owned an auto repair shop. And oftentimes a lot of salesmen would come to sell batteries, whatever they sell to auto repair garages, right? So they'd find him at the front desk and they'll say, hey, can we speak to the owner? Of course, he's the owner. He's not going to tell them he's the owner. He'll say, yeah, absolutely, sure. He'd walk around, go in the back, spend like 2 minutes, come back and say, hey, what's up? I heard you wanted to talk to the owner. How can I help you? And he used to do it all the time, right? I didn't have those privileges in school, in college, where I was in a predominantly white university. I didn't have that privilege in my first places of work. What have you found have been ways that you find African immigrants or refugees or people who were not born here but are Black do to cope with racism? Have people come to you for help, even to help them understand what their children may be going through that is different from what they're going through, and how to overcome those challenges or even be better advocates for their children or their family members?
I tell you, I often think about the degree of difficulty for our Black brothers and sisters who are not, Native Americans or of African American descent. And the what I believe first and foremost is that your parents and my parents and their parents um, experienced significant trauma
Mm,
that I think I believe that not only did it experience it, but it in many ways has gone untreated. And to your point, how our parents and grandparents responded to racism and discrimination, I think it was many of them responded in a way that was really all about self-preservation and protection.
mm,
And so you don't necessarily make a big deal out of being discriminated against. You just kind of, as your father had mentioned, just kind of almost roll with the punches, right?
right.
Recognize it for what it is, but keep it moving. And I want to suggest that that your father, that my parents, my grand, they were tired, and
Mm,
but it really was about reminding oneself that it's bigger than me. This is about my children, my children's children, protecting them, protecting my house.
yes.
And I think that coming to America, you're right. To your point, there can't be any sort of tutorial that you can access. Well, maybe today you can based on social media,
Right.
but I would say in maybe a decade ago, it was just it's you can read, you can. I want to suggest that the news and just television as a whole is clearly, creating a picture of what America is like, whether it's, in terms of racism, in terms of the Black culture.
Mm,
But I think that my experience has been in communicating with a lot of my African brothers and sisters is there's this significant sense of self-awareness and self-pride that I still believe is probably one of the most effective coping mechanisms that we can have as a
yes.
people is, I even tell my children, you have to know who you are. Like, I know who I
Yes.
am. I know who I am. I'm not going to wait for anyone to define me
Mm,
because that's what we do. Unfortunately, if we're not careful, if we don't know who we are, if we're not intentional about defining who we are, then we leave it open for someone else to define who we are. And so a lot of my brothers and sisters who are coming from Africa and the Caribbean, there's a strong sense of history, of understanding from whence they've come. And I think that is the part that, at the same token, that is the part that I think is serving as such a disadvantage for those of African American descent is just as a collective are the fact that there's so much there's such a lack of knowledge from which we
mm,
right. And so as was mentioned in the recording, in growing up in Detroit, I was able to access Claude McKay and Langston Hughes and Maya Angelou and Phyllis Wheatley. And I mean, we talk about like Black history.
yes.
I was fortunate. We started Black history in the first grade, for Pete's sake, right? And it's like, I
Yes.
was able to experience that throughout my formative years and then get to college and wanted more of it. And I'm not saying this to put myself on a pedestal. It's just that I was hungry
Mm,
at a very early age to really get a keen understanding of who I was. I was fortunate that I had parents who reminded me of who I was. And as mentioned,
yes.
I had every bit of success that was around me look like me.
Mm,
So I knew very early who I was. And so I say all that to say that, racism and discrimination, obviously it hurts. It can bring emotional pain and trauma. It can cause problems to our physical health. And we are, I think, unfortunately, we are forced to cope far too often with the ways that come by way of systemic racism and discrimination. And if I could, I would just snap my finger or wave a wand and just call an end to it. But I often say that I don't believe that racism is going anywhere.
Right.
I just don't.
Right.
And I'm one of the most optimistic brothers you're gonna meet. You hear me?
Right.
Flat out. But I also just I know I understand our country. I understand the foundation, unfortunately, of what America, how America evolved into what it is.
Right. Right. And to piggyback off of that thought that it may be a long time coming before we see the eradication of racism in this country. And even after, we know that now the field of psychology or psychology and psychiatric medicine, they're starting to think of ways that they can code for racial trauma as a medical billing code, right? Because it's real. So even after the hopeful eradication of racism, we also know that we will see the gradual effects still existing. How do you propose in the Black community we extend healing to one another despite our backgrounds, considering we are being asked to do the impossible? It's very hard to heal from something that is constantly bringing you down. Like I recently was talking to a friend and I said, imagine a veteran who is trying to overcome the trauma of PTSD from war, but he's being asked to do that in spaces of constant warfare. How do you heal from something that you're constantly experiencing? And how can we as a Black community extend empathy in order to help each other heal despite the environment that we are doing it in?
I think one of the first steps is a unapologetic commitment and a very intentional effort to recognize the value in one another. I think the basis of all things in terms of conflict is this devaluing, this lack of dignity and respect for the other person. I had actually posted on today. I'm planning on posting over the next couple of days. It was one of the, there's a woman by the name of Donna Hicks. She's an author, wrote a book called Dignity. Dr. Hicks has a significant experience in really serving as a peacemaker, and she'll go into war-torn countries and will try to find, and will sit with warring parties and will try to help to bring about and facilitate some sort of truce or peace. And she has it's her hypothesis that the very foundation of conflict is when you violate someone's dignity.
Ooh,
right?
Yes.
And I think if you look at it, even within our own community, within the Black community, I think there's a constant unfortunately, work of just violating each other's dignity. I don't think it's just common to the Black community. I think it's very much, unfortunately, part of American culture. But I do agree that it's the foundation quite often of conflict. And so she had one of her 10 ways to really uplift or approach folks or recognize folks and their dignity. She's one of the first things is approach people as being neither inferior nor superior to you. Give others the freedom to express their authentic selves without fear of being negatively judged. Interact without prejudice or bias, accepting the ways in which race, religion, ethnicity, gender, class, sexual orientation, age, and disability may be the core of other people's identities. Assume that others have integrity. Okay, so when you look at the last in particular, I think just grabs you. Assume people have integrity.
Oh man.
Right. Quite often, the assumption, we assume quite a bit. We can look at someone. We can, based on where they come from, even before they even open their mouths, we can begin to assume.
Right.
But but we also begin to assume based on where someone comes from. Right. That's dangerous.
Yes.
And when we assume, it's not always it's not always in the best. Um, it's not always with the best in mind. I want to suggest
Correct.
that quite often these days we are, I think, more accustomed to or wedded to the idea of assuming the very worst in someone. The very worst in someone.
Hmm.
What she suggests is assume that others have integrity. And
Right.
when I look at our community, the Black community, you know, I'm a guy. I really believe again in this practice of self love.
Hmm.
I believe in this practice of respecting or giving people respect and dignity.
Yes.
And more importantly, I recognize the value of really seeing the very best in someone.
Yeah.
Like, how can we work from that place? Like,
Hmm.
how can that be a starting point of really wanting to see the best in someone, but also wanting to do all that you can to help someone else succeed, right?
Right.
It's. I don't think it's Pollyannish. I don't think it's corny. I think it's very doable.
Yeah.
And I think if any community can do it, I think it's our community. I think we can model that.
I agree. I really am grabbed by that notion of extending respect and treating people with dignity and having a positive assumption of their intentions, like assume positive intent
Mhm.
from your fellow brother or sister.
Yeah.
And allow each other grace to learn, right? Because there is a lot to be learned. I always use myself as an example because that's where the greatest learning for me has occurred is in my life experience. But I will be honest and say, we need each other, right? Like, for example, in my life right now, my parents have migrated back to Kenya for retirement. I mean, they wasted no time. I think 4 months or so, or less than 6 months after I became stable in Michigan, they left. And I was like, wait a minute, hold on. I remember calling my dad and saying, wait, you guys like for real are not coming back? And he was like, no. He said, we were there for a reason. We came there to educate you and your sister and make sure you have a good life. He said, did we educate you? I said, yeah. Do you have a good life? I suppose. Okay, then. And I said, well, what is the plan for Hilda and I? Are we supposed to join you? Are we coming home? He said, I have no clue and I don't care. And he said, you could do whatever you want. As for my wife and I, we're done.
Right.
And so that's when I realized, wow, from the age of 11 on back, so from an infant to age 11, I don't have any experience in the United States. And my parents are gone back to Kenya. So if I am to build a life here and have a family here, I need my Black American brothers and sisters to help me navigate that phase of life because I have no point of reference.
Mhm.
No point of reference on how to advocate, raise a child. Heck, we hear even the statistics of Black women disproportionately dying at childbirth. Lord Jesus, I don't want to die.
Right.
And so, I told a friend a while back, I said, one of my greatest fears, and I'll say this transparently, because again, it's my experience. One of my greatest fears is to marry somebody with a European last name, and then I lose my Kenyan last name, which I know, you know, goes before me in spaces on my resume and doesn't have the same effect in predominantly white spaces as an African American last European name, right? So if I got married to Mr. Green and I'm now Christine Green, I have to instantly assume the identity of a Black American woman and all that she carries from her ancestors without even having that be my lived experience. But because of systemic racism and the effects of such in the systems that we navigate every day to make a life in this country, how am I supposed to get a crash course on all that entails? Because that's all that's going to come towards me and my family.
Mhm.
And I tell people that is how deep this really is. That's how deep it is. The moment you migrate and you assume the culture of a native of a foreign land, whether it be by changing your name or by raising children there, it is extremely difficult because you have to learn how people like you are perceived. And if you are being perceived as inferior, as without value, your life doesn't matter. You're seeing people that look like you being slain on a daily basis on national television. Where are you harboring all that and then being expected to be productive? And so, how can we within our community extend grace and love and not have this scarcity mentality, right? We are always feuding sometimes, even over culture. Like, I know some African people who are not happy when Black American people wear dashiki or African print for Juneteenth. Who owns that?
Right.
Like, seriously,
They're gonna be mad at me because I got a closet full. So
you know.
tell them to holler. Tell them to holler.
And so I'm really hoping we can work together more often, and for people like me who are immigrants to extend the dignity for people of different Black ethnicities to those that are back in our native lands, because these stereotypes are global. What people think about Blacks in America is global. When I lived in England, I was expected to assume the identity of a Black American. I didn't even know what to do. I said, I thought I was Kenyan. They're like, no, aren't you from America? And don't Black Americans live this way? I said, oh, really? I'm like, no, I have Black American friends. They don't live that way. They don't act. What are you talking about? And so I think there is something here that we can work with. Is there anything in your current work that you're doing, whether it be with the city or with Urban League, that can help build bridges towards more unity and harmony in our Black community?
I would say the work that I'm doing in both spaces really is just continuing down the path of trying to create a space where we can take have a greater sense of pride of who we are, and not necessarily feel as if we have to respond or act according to a cultural norm that was not established by us as a people.
Right.
I often say about the Urban League, I've been there now for 9 years, and I will tell you this: we're one of 93 affiliates throughout the country, and we have a pretty solid reputation here in Grand Rapids. We've been here for 78 years, but I would tell you, there's a significant amount. There's a significant amount of nonprofits in Grand Rapids.
Yes.
It goes without saying that one of the hardest dollars to raise is the dollars that I raise for our organization. I'm not saying that as a plea to raise money. I'm just saying that because we are unapologetically Black, and because that we are working diligently to try to improve the life chances of Black folk, it's not that we turn people away. We will serve anybody,
right?
But we just happen to have a laser beam focus on Black folks. And so, that is a work that we are intentional about. We are unapologetic about. And it's something that I think is key in the Black community is to be able to create organizations to where we as a community feel not just comfortable, but confident in going to, because we feel safe, because we feel we won't be judged, because we feel we can get the help if that's possible. In terms of the city, I continue to try to do all that I can to create a city again that is, plenty that grows in terms of opportunities for those who have been historically marginalized, in particular Black folk and our Latinx brothers and sisters. And that is something that I think will, if we do that right, that can distinguish us as a city. You're talking to a guy who I believe with my heart that we can be a model medium-sized city and really show this is how you get it done in terms of creating more opportunities for folks who, again, have been historically marginalized in this city, in this country. And so, I am. I don't necessarily make any bones about it. I want to see more people win, but in particular, I want to see more Black folks win, because we we haven't won a lot, right?
Right.
And it's okay. And I think part of how the Lord has wired me is God has given me the ability to translate and to communicate and to build relationship with folks outside of my community. So
Mm,
a lot of my white brothers and sisters, and it's not an effort to try to necessarily beat them down, but it really is an opportunity to help them better understand by providing more context. I think at the end of the day,
absolutely.
they're operating with a limited context.
Absolutely.
Because just like you mentioned a lot of the things that weren't taught in school about Black folks. Yeah, they didn't know either, right? And
Right.
I'm not making excuses, but
Right.
the reality is if all they know is part of the narrative,
Correct.
then they're operating, they're operating on assumption as well.
Right. Absolutely. And I see some questions coming at us, Joe. This one's for you. What are the challenges in building Black coalitions between African immigrants and African Americans? What are the challenges in building Black coalitions?
I think you mentioned it earlier that there really is, I think, for a lot of my African American brothers and sisters, there is the feeling that our African brothers and sisters perhaps look at us as inferior. That perhaps our African brothers and sisters have bought into that false narrative, European narrative, that we are not equal to. And I think that gets in the way. I think
Yes.
also that there is, again, a significant learning gap in terms of our understanding of our brothers and sisters from Africa, right?
Mm,
Again, there's something to be said about the fact that Christine, you have a unique, not so much unique if you look at it from a global perspective, but from an American perspective, as a Black woman, again, you don't have the lineage that speaks to, having having ancestors who experienced chattel slavery.
correct.
That's a big deal. That's a really,
Yes.
and so, whereas it's been part and parcel of our experience, and it
Mm,
has, helped to, I think, create the system that we're in today. You didn't have to experience your parents and all your parents and grandparents may have experienced oppression of some kind.
yes.
It wasn't it was not that it wasn't something that was perhaps that of the magnitude of chattel slavery, right?
Right.
Or the Jim Crow South, right?
Correct.
But I think that if it was possible, just the ability for our African immigrants and African American brothers and sisters to really spend more time together, and of course that's difficult in the midst of pandemics. But if it was possible to just, there's something to be said about presence and each other's presence,
Yes.
right? And beginning to kind of break through some of that BS. And again, as Dr. Hicks says, kind of, assume that the other has integrity, right? Just assume the best in the other, right? And I think
Yes.
that gets in the way when it comes to trying to develop a relationship between African immigrants and African Americans. And some of my brothers and sisters in the African American community would say, "Hell, we got to work on us first. We have to, as an African American community, find ways to get along better before we can talk about having a better relationship with African immigrants." I want to
But
suggest
do we have time, Joe? Do we have time? We've run out of time.
we don't.
We don't have time. People are dying.
Correct. And I think that there's value that can be brought to the dialogue and the conversation by our African immigrant brothers and sisters. I do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. The next one seems directed to me. What is something you wish African Americans would know or consider when meeting an African immigrant? Oh, Lord. Um, I'm going to talk about this African immigrant because I am not a voice of all the African immigrants, okay? And I'm not going to say that what I say represents the experiences that my fellow African American brothers and sisters will have interacting with other African immigrants. I will say for me, it is all love. And I will say it has been a journey. Expect that an immigrant Black is on a journey of reconciliation of what their identity now means. And that may be very difficult. They may be looking for somebody to blame. I know there were times I was bullied at school and didn't know who to blame.
Mm.
Who can I blame for coming to this country Black? Who can I blame for coming to this country with an accent? Who can I blame for going home to a household where that was not dinner table conversation? And as a child, I didn't have all the support all the time because we were raised to be strong. We were raised to overcome. And that is where the similarity comes in. I found that a lot of my African American friends were raised to be strong. They were raised to overcome. They were not raised to come and cry at the dinner table every day. So again, our upbringings tend to be similar, but the place in which our interactions and lived journeys intersect or collide, people are on different journeys. And so extend grace. You know, I may still be trying to figure out everything that's happening to me. Take into consideration the age in which somebody came to this country. If you're talking to somebody who came here as a child, as a teen, and you meet them in their 30s like myself, I'm a little bit more further in the journey and in the place of understanding what we could have in common. If you met my parents 3 months into resettlement, they may not have been your favorite person because they're very shell-shocked at how they're being received by the community, whether it's in white spaces or African American spaces. And understand that we are willing to share our culture, but once we get to a place where it's not received, we retreat into a shell. If you go to work with your food and you microwave it and people say something about how it smells, you're probably never going to talk about your culture again in that space. And it's probably going to be a triggering or traumatic experience as you move into other spaces where it concerns your food. What is the likelihood I'll invite you to a cookout at my house if you were part of the people who didn't understand the smell of my food at work? Like, you know, it's just those kind of small micro, dare I say, aggressions that you could go through as an immigrant, and then you carry them along. So I would just say, understand that we're here for different reasons, and depending on the reason that brought somebody here, that is their focus. And depending on their first few experiences and who they have around them in their African community, their ability to receive another Black person from this country is different. Again, I came here as a child. So at my age now, I am an easy African to get to know. But if you meet my cousin who maybe just got here for college and all he has is the perception of the African American community from what he sees in the media, and mind you, that's the media that's even allowed to be viewed back home, because not all the educational, empowering Black programming is being viewed in Africa. We're seeing the rap videos, the stand-up comedy, we're seeing the movies, and they are ridden with negative stereotypes of the Black community. So when we come here, it's almost, it's hard to try and find what was true and what wasn't when you don't have authentic relationships with Black people already established in your African community. If I came to this country and let's say found my auntie married to an African American man, it probably would have taken us less time to be able to build connections and meaningful relationships with the African American community around us. But that wasn't the case. It was more likely that a family member would marry a white person before an African American person. And again, the cycle continues, because where there is no proximity, there is no relationship, there is no empathy, there is no dignity, there is no extending of positive intent, there is none of that. And so you continue living in isolated bubbles of assumption that are dangerous, operating from the lies of a single story about each other's culture, about each other's livelihoods, about each other's, family structures and values, and you never move forward. You never move forward. And so I think that's my long-winded answer. There's another one, Joe, here at both of us. I'll have you go next. Given that there is so much linguistic variety among African immigrants, why aren't there more African immigrants in Black churches and institutions?
Yeah, I'll speak rather quickly. In terms of the Black church, I think historically you're looking at a place and a space that has been that was at one time that that place of refuge. It was the place where you could be you. It was the place
Mm,
there was no need for you um, to take on a certain posture other than to praise, because
mm,
you were home, you were comfortable, you were amongst those who were of like mind.
yes.
I want to suggest that when it comes to the African immigrant, because I know that we have a number of churches in town that are just predominantly African immigrants. I understand, and I understand why we have churches that are predominantly white. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm of the opinion that one day there will be, I think, a greater effort put forward to have a church that is more integrated and more
Mm,
diverse. But I think it really does speak to ultimately recognizing the church as that place that is a place of comfort, a place of peace, a place where you can be who you want to be and need to be without having to be who someone else wants you to be.
mm.
And so I would say that for the church. I think, where are we at with time? I'll let you jump in. I think
We're almost there. Yeah. I would say the same. I think Sunday for me is a day of rest, rest from all things. I don't want to think about what the person next to me thinks of me, what they see when they look at me. I don't have time for that. I just want to be there with Jesus and people that look like me, that that are giving me the energy that I'm giving them, right? And so I would say the same. Yes, is there grace to be extended for African immigrants and African Americans to worship separately? Yes. But is there an intentionality that can be also existing in the same space to perhaps have programming that brings our churches together intentionally? Can we do a rally once a year for back to school? Can we do some tutoring classes after school for the kids that brings two different churches together? Absolutely. I think there is room for both to exist, and it's necessary, because comes a time when you just want to be with your people, however that looks like. And that is the thing. Blackness is not one thing. We are so diverse. In fact, there are francophone speaking Africans that want their own rest from Anglo-Saxon speaking Africans. Like the diversity never ends, and if we expect it to all mesh in one pot, that would be unreasonable, I think.
I agree.
And lastly, what practical things or spaces can we get into to advance these ideas between the people? I think we are doing it right now, right here, right now,
Agree.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I
Actually, again, in the midst of pandemics, this is probably the best medium for now. But I think as soon as there's a green light for us to integrate and to come into one space, I would hope that this would really serve as a springboard
yes.
for those conversations. I'm sure that's part of your vision, and I can't say enough about your vision and the fact that you are carrying this thing out. And I look forward to helping whatever way I can, because I think it's critically important, and I need you to know that you're critically important. So,
Thank you, Joe. I'm not gonna lie and say I'm confident all the way. I'm scared, but I'm choosing to do this scared because we've run out of time to not do anything.
that's
And
right.
so here we are. I'm so grateful to WGVU. I'm very grateful to you for being here. Thank you to all our listeners out there. Thank you to anybody who encouraged me during this process, all my friends that helped me think through ideas, brainstorm, be part of a think tank. I'm just so grateful. And I just hope that wherever you are, if you are a Black person right now listening to this, think of ways that you can do this work in your own spaces. Just me and Joe here talking about it is not enough. And, we have to have everybody do a little piece of this where they are with what they have. So thank you, everybody, for listening. We appreciate you so much. And let's stay tuned as we continue this conversation in the future. And we look forward to hearing what you're also doing to move the needle forward in uniting all Black people in our community. Thank you, everybody. Have a great